Hi, this is Eric Prystowsky for another segment of EP on EP. With me today is a very special person I've known for many years and is our guest for actually a three-part series, James Youngblood. James and I met each other at the American Heart when I was on one of their planning committees, and subsequently I had the pleasure of being on the search committee in about 2001 or 2 when we brought him on as our CEO. But just to give you a very brief background, when I started, it was NASB. I went to the first meeting in 1980. Over the years, the society grew, and it was clear to us that we needed somebody with a very different skill set, and that's where James came in. So James, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Eric.
And what I really like to start with is you had a very respectable job at the American Heart, for sure. I was on the committee, and I really looked up to the work you were doing. And I was delighted when you decided to come over to this youngest organization versus the Heart. So first of all, why? Why did you do it?
It's a good question. So I spent 18 years at the American Heart Association, and in the last job, I was Executive Vice President of Science Operations. So I ran the science side of the organization. And, I'd been there. I was sort of ready for a change. And I was recruited when NASB started doing the search for a new CEO. And so I interviewed and went through the series of interviews and then met with the search committee for the last interview. And it was, for me, kind of a magical experience because I felt like it was less of an interview than it was our sitting there and thinking through the future of the organization and how we would create the strategy and process to get there. So it was very intriguing to me, and I thought it was a great opportunity.
Well, you're very nice to say that, because being one of the people on the committee, along with David Canham, I believe Mike Kane, I don't remember the whole committee, you really stood out. But I will tell you, there were some really good candidates. I told the committee, I don't think he was going to come. He's this big shot at the American Heart. So we were thrilled when you accepted. So now you come on board. You had a couple months with David, but then I had the real pleasure of spending the first year you were there revamping the society. So tell me what your thoughts were on your strategic plan. Now you've come over, you kind of thought it through. Give us, the audience, some idea of where your head was at.
Well, I think my first thought was, oh my God, what have I done? What have I got myself into? Because it was a great organization. NASB had such a great heart, and people were so passionate about the organization in the field, but it needed a lot of work. The staff were terrific, but they were terrific for the organization that NASB had been, not the one that we'd envisioned for the future. So I kind of jumped in and immediately started planning this strategic planning process, started looking at staff for what we were trying to do and making changes pretty immediately. So 6 to 7 months after I came on board, we had that big strategic planning summit, which you'll remember, and sort of laid out the plans for the society for the next 5 years, which led to a name change, ultimately to relocating the organization to Washington, getting rid of most of the staff and sort of starting all over again in DC.
So I do remember that. It was a whirlwind year for me, I know, and then of course it went on after I was out of my presidency. Let's start with some of the things. Let's talk about a little bit the governance changes that you instituted.
Yeah.
Walk us through that.
Well, you were very instrumental in our working together to make that happen. So what typically happens in an organization is you develop a strategic plan and then look at your governance structure to make sure it supports that plan. So that's what we did. The governance structure really had not been looked at or revised in years. There were too many committees. There's not great shape to it. So you and I sort of methodically went through with Robin Johnson, if you remember.
I remember that.
And created a new governance structure with new committees and membership and all that, which we've revised since then, but that initial structure has pretty much stayed with us since that time.
And then there was also a staff restructuring. What were your thoughts on that? Because the society grew up as like a mom and pop show, in little outskirts of Boston, right? And then it's now moved into the big time with you. What were the immediate needs you thought for staff restructuring?
Well, the NASB staff were terrific people. They had put their lives and souls into building the organization, but most of them, particularly when we decided to move to DC, most of them couldn't move. I mean, they were local people and didn't really want to relocate. So there were 5 of us out of a staff of about 40 who moved to DC. And one of the reasons that we moved to DC is that there's a built-in population of skilled, professional, nonprofit staff people. So we had a good potential pool of employees there. And just started building, the senior team, and then kind of taking it from there. And after 4 or 5 years, we had a pretty solid team.
So let's talk about the Washington move, because that was pretty controversial.
Yep.
I mean, a lot of the old leadership, to them it was the Boston area. You mentioned a little bit about it. Go into more detail, because I remember you telling us there were like multiple levels. I mean, you mentioned like the getting more staff and people, but didn't you have in your plans the other organizations to work with? I mean, there must have been multifactorial. You thought the move was important to Washington.
Well, I think if you remember, the drive for all of this was trying to build the NASB, then HRS brand into the premier brand in the field of heart rhythm disorders, and recognized globally for that. So being in Boston and Natick was just not good positioning for. So I think everything we did was to try to build the brand. And the rationale, we went through a long decision-making process looking at all the major cities that have nonprofit organizations, and settled on DC, in part because we wanted to be closer to the Hill and build our governance, the legislative and regulatory presence in DC, and it was a wise move. It's been very successful.
So it was really then multi-pronged. It was better for maybe staff recruitment, interorganizational work, and the things that you had planned, which we didn't do much of in the earlier days, working with people on the Hill.
Yeah, that's true.
Like.
Yeah.
So one of the most controversial things, of course, was a name change.
Yeah.
And that's a difficult thing. So I would like to ask you now, since I never asked you before, did you always plan on that, or did you act like this was a brand new idea at the time? Because that was a huge move.
It's probably somewhere in my head, but I remember one of the early presidents who told me that I came on board and said, North American Society of Pacing Electrophysiology is kind of a mouthful. And people said, well, that's why we call it NASB. And I said, that's my point, exactly.
What is NASB, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
One of the presidents said to me, by the time I get the name of the if I'm doing a media interview, by the time I get the name of the organization out, they're done. Our time's up. So I think it was something that I thought about. It was, of all of those changes that we made, you were right, it was the most difficult.
So tell me a little bit about the name change. I saw it from a person who realized you were right.
Yeah.
I mean, the first year I spent with you was transformational for me, just even as a leader, and things I learned from you I used, I hope, to my betterment in the rest of my career. You added that layer of professionalism to it. Mm-hmm. So the name change, though, was a whole different process. Do you want to, I don't think people realize what you had to go and what that leadership went through. Tell our audience a little bit about what you had to go through a name change.
Well, we delayed it because I was concerned that if we took that on, we wouldn't accomplish the other things that we were trying to accomplish, because there was so much change. We appointed a task force to look at the name and consider changing it. David Canham and Michael Kane were on that task force. And I hired a guy, branding consultant that I'd worked with before, who came in. We did a workshop. We were at DFW Airport, did a workshop. David Canham was one of the biggest opponents of the name change. And so Dwayne Knapp, the consultant, started talking about the importance of brand and what brand means and what it could mean to the organization. And I looked down, and David Canham, who was sitting next to me, was writing new names on a cocktail napkins. Oh my. We are on our way now. So,
now you got rid of that.
Yeah,
that
so it took a process to come up with the name. Originally we changed it to the Heart Rhythm Association.
Because I remember that
thought at the time,
huge discussion about that.
Thought at the time that we might get patients involved at some point. And we went back to society because I think there was a sense that we needed to keep that as part of the past, that it was more of a medical organization.
Right, and I remember that. It was so interesting to see that it wasn't just finding a new name, one that meant something other than NASB. Yeah. But I remember that whole discussion on association versus society. I don't think anyone who hasn't been through this would even understand why that became an issue. But it was because of the issue of who do we represent, right? And we represent our patients in the area of heart rhythm.
Yeah, association was kind of gave you a broader sense of the organization,
Right.
but there were people who were opposed to that. So I think we settled on society to...
So that takes you through your first kind of 5 years as the CEO.
Yeah.
As you look back on it before we go to the next segment, which we'll do in a moment, thoughts, regrets, wish you had done things differently, or were you pretty happy of your first 5 years? 'Cause it was the first 5-year chunk, right?
It was actually probably 6 years.
Okay.
But, no, I wouldn't change a thing. I mean, I never could have done it without you and the other leadership folks who were around at the time. There were many times when I had to be talked off a ledge because there were days when multiple times when I would say, I cannot do this anymore.
So, truth be known, you know what happened to me, because one of the changes that you felt was important, and I thank you for doing it,
right.
was to make the Board of Trustees not evergreen. I mean, up to that point, you could be to every meeting, and we would have people from 20 years ago coming that had no really inkling what was going on. But a very famous person, who I'll leave nameless, at a very well-known meeting in Asia, got up in front of everyone, and as we were taking a picture together, and he said, I was one of the founders of the society, and Eric threw me out.
Yeah.
So it was not very pleasant on the other side, but they were tough changes all around, but they were needed, and clearly put us on a different trajectory as a society.
Yeah, agreed.
So we're going to stop at this point and stay tuned for part 2.